Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. It's the first time actually I'm presenting in a conference, so I'm a little bit nervous, and it's also funny that I'm after the peak of the conference, the debate on inflation, and then there is me that I'm just presenting my master thesis. So, well, I hope I'll not disappoint anyone, but let's see. So my master thesis was about interest rate, monopoly factor, and the actual trend of income distribution. An analysis in the light of the monetary theory of distribution. So essentially what has happened, my interest has always been between functional income distribution and monetary policy and interrelation, of course. I did my first year of the master in Roma 3, where there are a lot of Sraffians, and they were like, hey, there is actually a group of Sraffians that just work about something that is called monetary theory of distribution. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Let's watch it out. Also because the main critique that is always moved towards Sraffian is that there is no money. So the fact that there is a group of Sraffian working with money is a good thing to do. I was like, okay, let's look it. And so I'm doing a sort of theoretical review of the monetary theory of distribution, then some application of it. I see that there can be some problem, and I try to explain what are the problems in this application. So just classical Sraffian analysis, there is this surplus that at the end of the production process has to be divided between profits and wages above subsistences. There is a paper from Stirati in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, 2018, that there are 3 different ways of closing the Sraffian system, so to closing the system of prices. The classical one is taking the wage rate as given, so the real wages as given. This is like as in the classic, as in Ricardo, and so this is a way, and profits are the residual. Otherwise, there are 2 ways of taking the profit as given, and that can be the Cambridge equation, so a link that was made by Fasinetti, Calder, and others, or the monetary theory of distribution, as suggested in Pivetti, Panico, and others, that is taking the profit rate as the sum of 2 independent magnitudes that are the interest rate, the long-term risk-free interest rate, and the normal profit of enterprises. So Pivetti and the others advocate for this monetary theory of distribution because in a fiat economy, usually workers doesn't bargain. I mean, they try to bargain for their real wages, clearly, but they usually end up bargaining for the nominal wages, and the real wages can be decided with some margin by the firm. So in their idea, the monetary theory of distribution, and hence having the real wages as a residual variable, was an improvement, and also adding monetary analysis inside the framework. So as I said, in Pivetti, there is this idea that the interest rate is a monetary phenomenon. The nominal wages are taken as given. There is this, like the rate of profit is made by the interest rate at which it's summed, this normal profit of enterprises that are not just given by monopoly factor or oligopolistic competition, is a sort of remuneration for the capitalist in order to employ capital productively, in a sense, and is seen as a result of habits and social convention, in a sense. And they should be stable through time, or at least depending on how the social convention evolve. And in this idea, the interest rate represents a opportunity cost of employing capital. Then there is the theorization of Panico that try to improve some aspect, because in the Pivetti framework there is no banking system, no, there's just this interest rate that is there, but there's no how this interest rate is set, why, and so on, in a sense. And in Panico, so there is an explicit banking sector, but there are some problems because the structure of interest rate is not explicitly formalized, or if it is, there are some like in his theorization, this has been evolving through time since the first publication in the 90 to the latest publication in 2017, for example. In this case, in Panico, the interest rate is not just an opportunity cost, but is also an effective cost of production of the banking sector. So there is an improvement in a sense. Then there is Ciccarone. It is a strange exercise in a sense, because in Ciccarone, the Sraffian equation are left untouched, but the interest rate and hence the monetary policy are introduced in a way that the banking sector became the only basic commodity in all the economy. That is quite strange as intake, because this means that the general profit rate is determined and is by the banking sector that acts as an attractor. It is quite unrealistic, but it's interesting because on the work of Ciccarone, Boschi and Feldman developed another model on the monetary distribution, adding some interesting intakes as the leverage ratio. These are more modern, more recent publication on the topic, like from the last 3 years. So it's a vivid topic apparently. There is this summer, Zolea published this monetary theory of distribution analysis, where instead of the profit rate taken as given is the wage rate taken as given, but because the banking sector is formalized in a certain way, there is a monetary theory of distribution, so it's interesting, but also in some more particular Sraffian, like Zambelli, where there is no unique profit rate, uniform rate of profit, but there is different rate of profit. There is the introduction of money, and so a sort of trying to create also here a monetary theory distribution. Clearly, this is just the Sraffian side. There are a lot of other analyses on the role of monetary policy on income distribution in the broad post-Keynesian 10. We're here discussing it, and so it's quite known. It was part also in Kalecki, interest rate is part of the overhead cost, and so there are some model made by Hein where the markup is interest rate elastic, and it's interesting how it's similar in a sense to the model of Pivetti, let's say. And then, of course, the relation between creditors and debtors and all these things that are not modeled in this Raffian analysis so far, but that are deeply modeled in all the remaining post-Keynesian Kaleckian analysis. So, given this theoretical background, I try to move and see if the things was holding for the United States in the last decades, and how looking at the relation clearly between the long-term risk-free interest rate and the general rate of profit. Clearly, these are complex variable because everybody says the long-term risk-free interest rate, but which one is it? Also, the general rate of profit. What is the general rate of profit? So I updated some. I mean, I took from the variable the methodology from Shaikh and from Dumenil and Levy in their calculation of the general rate of profit, and I compared it to the long-term interest rate, the real one on 10 years bond of the United States. Clearly, the profit rate of both of Shaikh and Dumenil and Levy have some problems because, for example, in Shaikh there is no financial sector, so the profit rate doesn't it doesn't have the financial sector inside. Or in Dumenil and Levy, since their analysis and their methodology is based, it's a study on how interest rate, how profit rate tends to converge and to a unique and around the average value and how they tends to fall in a sense. They have dropped from the calculation and from their database some sector where the profit rate was not converging to the others. So this is clearly a little bias. And among these, there is probably the mining sector, if I remember well. So it's not the best, but the intake from this graph is that we have that since the 80s, what has happened, that long-term risk-free interest rate is decreasing. And it was part also in the presentation of Matthias Vernengo. But, and this, according to the monetary theory distribution, this should have led to a decrease also in the profit rate, but this is not taking place. It seems that the profit rate is remaining quite stable while the other is decreasing. So this is a problem on the monetary theory distribution. I'm trying to analyze how. If we look at another estimation of the profit rate using the adjusted wage share and the capital output ratio in a methodology suggested by Stirati, using the Ameco database, we can see also here that the long-term, there is this detachment between the two. And so this is problematic in a sense, because that's not what this theory would predict. Clearly, the validity of the theory is quite undermined. So before moving on the possible reason, it's important to stress that it's a theory of distribution. So in a theory of distribution, the rate of profit that should be used is the normal rate of profit, that is the rate of return on capital that can be obtained by the firm using the dominant technique and producing a normal capacity utilization. Clearly, this is not the case on reality. You're not always producing at normal capacity utilization, and it's not even, it's even difficult to see if you're actually in the long run or in average, you're producing at the normal capacity utilization. That is a debate on it between Ciccone and others, Sraffians. But I've used this estimation of the rate of profit as that are actual clearly, and looking at the trends, the idea was, okay, the trends is quite clear, so probably also the normal one is representing this, and that's why, but it's good to highlight this thing. So as a possibility, I wonder like, okay, it's the interest rate is decreasing, the rate of profit is remaining the same. In this theory, the rate of profit is made by the interest rate and by the normal profit of enterprise. This magnitude that's covered now, the risk and trouble, as I said, and they should represent objective elements or commonly perceived so that by conventional habits took place long enough to be regarded as normal. So the idea is that if there are autonomous factors who has influenced the normal profit of enterprise, this could explain this detachment that has occurred. And so I developed the analysis looking at the evolution of wage bargaining, volatility and perceived risk, top management remuneration, and monopoly power as a possible explanation between the detachment of the interest rate and the rate of profit. What is the time when I started? Okay, perfect. Okay, so on wage bargaining, there is a lot of work done by others, Raffian, and also by Pivetti himself, that highlighted these problems, like in a publication in 2018 and in a conference in 2016. And clearly, if we consider that the wage bargaining has decreased since the 70s with the Great Moderation and everything, this can be a clearly explanation of an increase in the normal profit of enterprise. This is a social change. And there are a lot of factors that are considered significant: shoring, unionization, the decrease in government expenditure, the flexibilization of the labor market. There are a lot of work on this, and it's known and it's widely acknowledged. But I would like to move also on other autonomous factors that can complement this analysis, that are usually not that highlighted on, at least in the Sraffian analysis, but also I think in the general framework when looking at this analysis. Well, volatility and perceived risk is just because it was to essentially show that the idea is that even though there has been an increase in the degree of liquidity investment with the increase in the market through globalization, and also in the depth of the market with commodification and in financial innovation, this has not led to the expected decrease in the normal profit of enterprise, but to an actual increase. So it's the opposite result of what we're searching for. And the idea is that according to a paper made by Barba and Pivetti in 2012, this is because also there's been a counterbalancing effect in the fact that the perceived risk of enterprise and the confidence of the capitalist class, even though since the 70s, clearly the capitalists have gained their bargaining position compared to the workers, the abandoning of the final demand policies and of stability and the increase clearly in instability and globalization has decreased their actual there's increased their perception of risk. So there's been a sort of counterbalancing effect. Regarding top manager remuneration, I add top manager remuneration to the analysis because it's something that was suggested by Pivetti himself. And essentially, the idea is that they have to be autonomous in sort of autonomous factor. So they have to represent some institutional or some social changes that have undertaken. Is clearly part of the shell order value maximization and all the things that has followed the role of the manager in the firms. And this has been highlighted by Boyer and others clearly, but it's also part of a longer historical process of internal financialization before of the external financialization as in our work. That's really interesting from Baronian and Pierre, that shows how this process of financialization has occurred also in a longer period and not just in the last year. And there's been it's just a continuation of a process that has already started. Clearly, it's widely known, the graph from Piketty and Sides that shows how even though the average salary has remained constant, there has been a clearly increase in the manager remuneration. So this can be represented as with the variable MR here. And so can be one of the elements increasing this normal profit of enterprise that Piketty himself renowned as a sort of markup in a Kalekian way, you know. So this can be clearly an explanation, and it's one of the possible one I'm talking about. But then the one I'm stayed more and I try to develop more is the presence of monopoly power. So clearly the ability of setting the price or influence the setting of the price, or also to maintain barrier to entry and exit, especially. And I try to do it inside a monopoly capitalism approach, so some Marxist idea that was also developed by Veblen, and that is also present in Kalecki, clearly with oligopolistic competition, and taking also something from the tendency towards capital centralization, this idea in the third volume of the Capital of Marx. So regarding monopoly power, clearly a good start is the sectoral analysis, and there are plenty of work on it. For example, all the work from the monthly review and by Foster and others. Some example, the manufacturing, where in the sector of the manufacturing, both the number and the percentage of industry where the largest four company accord for at least 50% of the industry total shipment value has constantly increased, but also the banking sector, because it's one of the clearest that has been an increasing concentration, where if we look at the graph of the 5 asset concentration for the United States, we see that since the end of the 90s, where the 5 largest banks were holding the 30% of the asset, now they're holding more than 45%. So there's been clearly an increase. And this increase is part of social and institutional process of the regulation, as highlighted by Tregenna. And it's not driven by efficiency per se, but it's driven by a social decision, because it leads also to the presence of mega banks and intrinsic instability to the system. But the point is that using a sectoral analysis can be misleading since globalization, but because there has been other way through which monopoly power has found a way to be maintained. And this can be corporate control, for example. This idea was already present in Marx, in Hilferding. And the idea is that when there are just a company, is not the point is not who owns the capital, but who actually control the capital. And this is clearly relevant with the evolution of the credit system. And since the 70s, there has been a process of reconcentration that has been highlighted by Brown, where there has been this shift, as we all know, towards asset management company. And also there's been a concentration also in the number of these, like the big three has reached on average 21% of the average Standard & Poor's 500 firms. So they own a big share of the stocks of the corporation. And the process of centralization of corporate control has also been confirmed in a global level by an interesting paper by Brancaccio and others in 2018, using network analysis. Is quite an innovative technique on this field. And so corporate control can be clearly a way through which monopoly power has been maintained and implemented. And the other one is intellectual property rights. So the use of intellectual property and this intangible asset, because clearly even if knowledge is a non-rival good, can become excludable through institutional and social, through a legal framework that has actually occurred since the 70s. And this is what has been named by Pagano intellectual monopoly capitalism. Is a field that is keeping on by other scholars like Recap, like Duran, and many others. And clearly, if we look for the US, it's even if patents clearly is not a good, is not the best proxy ever, can be found something else, but it at least represent in a sense the presence of intellectual monopoly capitalism. We can see that since the 90s, there has been an important increase in the number of patent applications for US resident firms. And this is not just temporary, this monopoly power is maintained because in the intellectual monopoly capitalism, this is not temporary because it's reinforced through time, because the innovator is not the innovator, the people, the least innovator is put in a subordinate position, and hence this maintained through sort of barrier to exit the advantage position of the first innovator. So, concluding in a sense, the first theoretical part was highlighting essentially the fact that there is in all the post-Keynesian framework, not just in the Kalekian sub-branch, but also in the Sraffian, the clear idea that monetary policy can have an influence on income distribution, on functional income distribution, and they can have also a direct influence on functional income distribution. And still using the lens of the monetary theory of distribution, something doesn't work quite well. The detachment between the long-term risk-free interest rate and the profit rate in the US is clear, but there can be some autonomous factor as the monopoly power, especially corporate control, or the use of intellectual property right, that can give an explanation to an increase in the normal profit of enterprise, and hence adding an explanatory power to the monetary theory distribution as an approach. And essentially that's it, and thank you very much.